Hi, I'm Susan Papanicholas from How Does Your Garden Grow in Seattle, Washington. Thanks for tuning in to our Getting the Garden Ready for Spring series. It's late winter in the garden. It's pretty darn cold, but there's so much that you can do at this time of year to get your garden set up for a fantastic spring. And oftentimes the jobs that you do now will save you so much work once you get to spring. You may have seen our videos in this series about cutting back deciduous perennials, deciduous grasses, and evergreen ferns. Those are pretty straightforward topics that are easy to make broad generalizations about. I'm going to try to tackle a topic that has a little bit more nuance and complication. Evergreen perennials are plants in your garden that are perennial. They come back year after year. They don't have a woody component to them like a tree or a shrub. There's no trunk or woody part of the plant. It's all soft and herbaceous growth. But they stay evergreen throughout the winter. So you have this foliage in the garden for the whole winter and throughout the year. There's a lot of different plants in this category. Some examples include evergreen ferns like sword fern, autumn fern, Himalayan maidenhair fern, heucheras. Also, hellebores are a type of evergreen perennial. There are also many grasses and grass-like plants like sedges that fit into the category of evergreen perennials. Sometimes at this time of year, when you get to the end of winter and they've had a rough winter, sometimes evergreen perennials look a little beat up. The foliage doesn't look great. Like this epimedium in front of me. There's a lot of bug bites on it. It's turned red. There's some brown leaves. It's not looking its best. When you have a plant like that in your garden, an evergreen perennial that looks like it's had a pretty rough winter, this is a great time of year to get rid of that beat up foliage. These plants are just about to put on new foliage, so when you cut this old foliage away, the new foliage will replace it pretty quickly, and it will be able to start photosynthesizing again and give energy to the root ball and help the plant grow. You wouldn't want to cut an evergreen perennial back at the beginning of winter because it needs that foliage to stay alive during the winter months. So now that we're at the end of winter, it's okay to cut this back if it's looking crummy. There are other plants where it might look pretty good at this time of year, but I know from watching it in the past that when the new foliage starts coming on, the old foliage will decline and fall away. And sometimes I want to prune that old foliage out ahead of time so it doesn't get mixed up with the new foliage and I don't have to untangle new leaves from old leaves when I get into later in the growing season. And also I can see the new growth coming up. So some examples of that are like this epimedium in front of me. I want to cut this back now. Even if it's looking okay, I know that this foliage is not going to look great later in the season, so I want to cut it back now. Or evergreen ferns. A lot of evergreen ferns will have the old foliage looks pretty crummy once the new foliage comes on, so I want to preemptively cut the old foliage away. Hellebores also do that. They have pretty good looking leaves sometimes now, but when the new growth comes on, those old leaves will turn brown and fall away. So with those plants, I'm really thinking about, will it be easy for me to cut the old leaves off once they turn brown, or will they get all tangled up and it's going to be a complicated job? So with things with fine stems like epimedium, ferns, grasses, I might want to preemptively cut them back because once the new growth comes in, it's going to be hard for me to untangle them. With things with bigger, coarser leaves like a heuchera or a hellebore, I can leave last year's foliage in place until it starts to decline. Because those leaves are so big, it's easy for me to snip them off one by one as they decline. So that's something I'm thinking about at this time of year. If it looks crummy now, I feel pretty good about cutting evergreen foliage back. If it looks okay, but I know from experience it's about to decline, I also feel pretty good about cutting that foliage back, especially if it's on a plant with really fine stems where untangling new growth from old growth is going to get complicated later. If I know from experience that that plant can leave its leaves for many years, I might be a little bit more cautious about cutting it back at this time of year and be more selective or prune it every few years. Sometimes there are some evergreen grasses that really benefit from keeping multiple years of foliage on them. So that's something that you can watch in your garden this spring. Maybe if you're uncertain, you could leave that foliage in place and see what happens throughout the course of this upcoming year to help you decide next year if you want to prune it back. I'm standing in front of one of my favorites. This is Disporum night heron. It's a really beautiful shade-tolerant perennial that has gorgeous spring growth habit to it, beautiful spring flowers, and then has this lovely evergreen foliage throughout the rest of the growing season, and it lasts beautifully through the winter. You might not look at this time of year and think it needs pruning because it looks pretty fantastic. But my favorite stage of this perennial is in March, when the new stems come out. They almost look like a stalk of asparagus poking out of the ground. They come up with a purple tinge to the stem, and the leaves unwind as it unfurls, and it can be so spectacular to watch. I almost have to go look at my Disporums daily when they're in their unfurling process because I get so excited about it. So this is a plant that I am going to cut back hard at this time of year so that I can see that unfurling without having all this other foliage in the way. So to do that, I'm just going to come in and cut this plant back at the base. I'm cutting each stem all the way back as close to the ground as I can. There are a couple of buds poking their way out of the soil, and I want to be careful not to nick those as I'm doing this job. But mostly, it's pretty easy because the new growth hasn't started. I don't have to be very careful. I can just come in and cut the entire thing back. This is going to look bare for a few weeks until the new growth starts, and then I'll have that really beautiful show of these unfurling stems to watch throughout the month of March. It'll fill out in April, all these leaves will unfurl, and it will be really beautiful for the growing season and next winter without old foliage getting in the way. So in this case, this was a really great plant to cut back entirely. So those are some things I'm thinking about when I'm looking at evergreen perennials and trying to decide if I should cut them back or not. To help me kind of make those decisions for myself and my circumstances in my gardens, having an understanding of why I might cut them back really helps me decide whether or not I want to cut them back. Hopefully it'll help you out too.